like back to, these myths that we're talking about of China and Africa. One of the biggest overarching ones is that the relationship of China and Africa is a neocolonial one. And that's the impression that most people in the US get, because that's the standard line that's often trotted out by US media. And, they have quoted a lot of politicians and pundits over the years that have repeated that same line. Like Mike Pompeo has said it. Hillary Clinton has said it multiple times. In 2011, she was quoted in a Reuters article as saying, well, this is from the quote, from the article, I mean. Clinton asked in a television interview in Zambia on Saturday about China's rising influence on the continent, said Africans should be wary of friends who only deal with elites. We don't want to see a new colonialism in Africa, Clinton said in a television interview on the first stop of a 5-day Africa tour. When people come to Africa to make investments, we want them to do well, but also want them to do good, she said. We don't want them to undermine good governance in Africa. So this idea that China is the new neocolonial power in Africa, I mean, that's clearly to obscure the US role in US history on the African continent, right? Because if you look at the US role in Africa, it's clear that the US just sees Africa as a source of cheap labor, resource extraction, a site of different USAID projects that end up just funneling money back into US capitalist hands.
Yeah, so I mean, there's two things you got to recognize here. The first thing is, Malcolm X told Fidel Castro when he visited New York for the United Nations, they wouldn't put him up in any hotel, so he had to go to Harlem, and he stayed in Harlem, and Malcolm X met him, and he said, if Uncle Sam hates you, you must be doing something right, or you must be a good man. Mm-hmm. The quote was something like that. One thing you have to understand, I want everyone listening to view history of the West versus the rest through the lens of development and the prevention of development, okay? If you view history through this, you will understand the world completely. Though it is for the West to maintain its standard of living, for it to be able to expropriate surplus from the global South and park it in its financial system, which is what it's been doing, which is how this financial system can gamble. You cannot have developed countries in the global South. You can have developed countries under your terms, under your vassalage, all of that, but you cannot have development in the global South. Development in the global South will directly lead to the demise of living standards, particularly in Europe. The United States will still survive. This is all about protecting Europe, the spiritual motherland of Western everything, right? So that's why, when you attack Ukraine, it's like, oh my God, Europe is being attacked. When Notre Dame burns, oh my God, mm-hmm. Notre Dame. Right? So the first Western, let's say, stronghold that will fall will be Europe, So this is about ensuring that development does not take place. So every time, a country is investing somewhere, the narratives are always going to be this, because you are literally building infrastructure in the hope that your cities become interconnected, in the hope that your incomes increase, in the hope that they become a market for better goods, in the hope that manufacturing develops. If all of these things happen, particularly in Africa, you're going to have a demise of living standards. I mean, Barack Obama went in front of a stage and said very clearly, we cannot have Africans spending and consuming like Western people. The earth can't handle it. Well, who built a planet where not everyone can be prosperous? I wonder who did that. But that's the first thing you got to remember. So these neocolonial narratives will come up. I mean, first of all, it's very rich for the biggest neocolonizers on the planet to even say that. I mean, they would know, because they're the ones still absolutely raping that continent. I see it with my own eyes. I don't see Chinese troops marching the streets in their armored vehicles. I see French troops. And you have to understand, the United States is not very active in Africa. I mean, they are militarily, but they outsource most of their policy and handling to the French. The French are in total charge of the African continent. The French ambassador runs every former French colony on that continent. And I see this, having worked in French countries, having worked with the government. they got to clear stuff with the French ambassador before they can do anything. The French ambassador is the president, the prime minister, judge, jury, executioner of most of these former French colonies. The second thing you have to understand, and this is on a more philosophical level, there's a quote, I believe, by a German who said this in like the 1800s. He said, "Africans are my brothers, but they are my younger brothers by several centuries." And, this quote to me is hugely insightful because you have to understand how the West sees Africa. The West sees Africa as a younger brother. They really see them. I mean, they're the abusive older sibling, but you are my younger brother. I have to protect you. And look, the Chinese are coming. I have to protect you. There is an entitlement over Africa that I don't think people really understand until you go there. I always tell people from my vantage point of having grown up in East Asia and having worked in Africa, the two biggest Western entitlements, one is over, and this some people might find this controversial, but I'm going to say it, one is over East Asian women, their bodies, their lives, everything.
Yeah.
And I've seen this in East Asia, growing up my whole life. That's the first entitlement. And the second is over African everything, resources, culture, everything. So you have to understand there is an entitlement over this continent that hugely drives Western anxieties towards what's happening there. They are our younger brothers. How can we let someone else work with our younger brothers? They are our younger brothers to beat, to exploit. Our younger brothers by several centuries, they're behind, they're backwards, but they are ours. We must protect them. And you have to understand, it's not that they're delusionally saying this stuff. They genuinely believe this stuff. We are the only ones who can protect you. We are your older siblings. Look at all that we've done for you. This is literally how some of them think. Literally, right? At the very highest levels of power. This is how it's thought of. Some are very conniving and just say this stuff because, post-colonial discourse has now become, it's so easy to weaponize it. Neocolonialism and debt and all this stuff. It's very easy to use these kind of buzzwords that work really well on a very hyper-moralized, morally aggressive, guilt-tripped out Western audience, right? So if you just place your history on top of it and say the Chinese are doing the same thing, it generates a great deal of, look, we are the good guys. We are the good guys. Look, they're our brothers, our younger brothers. We want to take care of them. I faced the same thing. When I started working with African music, which is a European man's game, let's not get it twisted. The Europeans have been the ones working with African music for the last 30, 40 years, African culture. To see our label, which is myself, an Indian from Southeast Asia, and my colleague who's Senegalese from Germany, a black and brown label working in Africa, we faced a whole lot of European gatekeeping. We faced a whole lot of Europeans telling us how we can do things, when we can do things, what territory. And they did it all through the same way, through this really minty, sweet language, but really they're just letting us know who's in charge. And, and we, through our East Asian way of doing things, have beat them out of certain music markets. So again, this is why I understand the Chinese way, or the Chinese conundrum so much, because I understand how they're doing things. I understand. Let me give you an example, a really personal conversation example. My roommate from university was from Nigeria, okay? And he now works in the Nigerian government. And I was in New York. I was back in New York at the end of last year for a few months. And he was in town for the UN General Assembly. Okay, now he is now an advisor to the Nigerian government. Okay, and he's attending, he's part of the UN delegation. And I saw him after like 14 years after we graduated. I said, hey, Arind, how are you? And we got to talking. I said, you're working with the government. What are you doing? He said, I'm in charge of this, this, and this, things that involve a lot of Chinese involvement. And he told me, I started asking about the Chinese. And, he also got irritated. He was like, man, let me tell you something, okay? And he told me the same thing I told you in my last talk. But he, talking as a friend on a personal level, he told it to me in a more just very candid way. He said, listen, the Chinese are basically giving us free money. I said, what do you mean? He's like, they are basically giving us free money. Let me explain to you, okay? He said, they are giving us money with 2 to 3% interest. And the loan has to be repaid in 20 to 30 years, okay? And then he told me, see that expressway they just built between two cities in Nigeria? He said, they gave us a 2 to 3% interest on that loan and 20, 30 years to pay it off. Mm-hmm. He said the tolls from that expressway can pay the interest off. Okay? And then he said, and the next thing he said I really, really enjoyed because it was very him. He said, if we cannot pay back that loan in 20, 30 years, we have no business being a government. And I love that he said that because that to me says, what makes you think the Chinese are putting a gun to his head? He was there when that deal was signed. What makes you, they took it on themselves to say, we can pay this back to you, no problem. He told me, the tolls on the highway will pay off the interest, and then we have 20 to 30 years to pay it back. I love that he put that kind of agency on himself that said, this isn't our court. What are you talking about? The Chinese came to us with a great deal and we said yes. And I love that he said, they're basically giving us free money, you know? And he said, listen, he also did say, he said, you know, it's not all, of course the Chinese are interested in making money back from this. Of course their banks want to make money from this. Their construction companies want contracts, of course, right? And he said, of course there is a motive of, you know, listen, we want to be able to come to you in a few years and say, hey, we did something for you guys. We worked well together. Vote with us at the next UN vote. You know, get our back on this. And that's totally fine. That's just how the global South is going to work together. You know, you're going to do things for countries because you're building a relationship with them. You're building a friendship with them. We do the same thing. Hey, Republic of Djibouti, we gave you all this, you know, amazing equipment for your archive. Hey, guess what? We want some more help to do some more work in your country or nearby, or what doors can you open? I mean, this is what, eye-to-eye level negotiating is. You know, so this kind of idea that the Chinese are neocolonizing, I mean, what is it about Africa that makes it so easy to colonize? Is everyone just sitting there waiting to be colonized? I mean, come on, people. Like, they are presented with proposals and propositions. And guess what? The Chinese one wins. It delivers the fastest for the lowest cost. And for the money that's being paid, it's pretty damn good quality. You know, I remember when the Japanese, people used to laugh about Japanese products, and now they're considered world class. The same thing will happen with Chinese products, by the way. So, you know, to me, when you talk, I talk to people in government. I talked to my roommate from college who I hadn't seen for 14 years. And when he told me this, I laughed. I said, this is exactly what I'm trying to tell people. And he said, you know, they'll never understand. And the other thing he said that was really interesting to me, he said, you know who's messing with Nigeria? I said, who? And we were in New York at the time. He said, it's these guys, AKA the United States, right? So, yeah. You know, so I have, you know, friends in government in West Africa. I have worked with governments in East Africa. I've been on the ground, and I don't know what people think neocolonialism is. I don't even think people know what it means. And I don't know what they think the Chinese are actually doing there. And yeah.
Well, so a tool that the U.S. tries to push, that what they say is a tool of neocolonialism, is this idea that China engages in debt trap diplomacy. And, you know, you were kind of hinting at this when you were talking about the paternalistic relationship that the U.S. has with Africa. You know, we can give them loans on our own terms, but anybody else that tries to give them loans on better terms that are more beneficial for countries in Africa, you know, we are going to say that it's not good for them and that they shouldn't do it. So, you know, you're talking about, you know, your friend was talking about like these low interest loans that can be paid over the course of decades that China lends to these countries. And so I feel like the entire discussion around China's debt trap diplomacy is it's again a projection of U.S. policy itself, which you were talking about earlier, but it's also again to obscure Western finance institutions' roles in Africa, because, you know, like, what is the IMF but a predatory lending scheme where they force loans onto underdeveloped countries with these exorbitantly high interest rates that lock them into debt forever. And then, you know, as a condition of these loans, the receiving countries have to undergo structural adjustment programs where, you know, they have to like privatize public services and state enterprises. eliminate food subsidies, reduce government spending, open their markets, and adopt free trade policies. It's like this Western imposed neoliberalization scheme that basically locks receiving countries into poverty and underdevelopment so that they can ensure continual plunder and resource extraction to benefit like multinational corporations. So what is that but a debt trap diplomacy scheme?
Yeah, I mean, you have to also understand that the West, the entire Western financial system runs off debt, right? Banks make money off American people's debt on a domestic level, and then they make money off countries' debt on an international level. Now, if you know, all of these countries in Africa that have, I mean, again, we should point out that 76% of African debt is still owed to the Paris Club of Investors, which is a group of private institutions, particularly in the city of London and in Wall Street, in Zurich, in Frankfurt, and all these financial capitals of the West. 76% of debt is still owed to them.
Yeah.
Okay?
It's the same situation in Sri Lanka as well. They're having a lot of demonstrations against the government because of high cost of food and fuel. And then U.S. media is trying to blame Chinese debt and Chinese loans, but the Western finance institutions own like 81% of the debt, like the overwhelming majority of the debt. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they were blaming India too, because India's given a lot of aid to Sri Lanka. So, I mean, you know, I just want people to look at a graph. It's a graph of who's going to control the majority of global GDP by 2050. And the graph goes from the 1800s. So the higher that graph goes for China and India in particular, which are going to control over 50% of global GDP by 2050, the higher that graph goes, the worse the attacks are going to be on both countries. And for someone who follows how India and Indians are covered, I see a lot of very similar narratives cropping up. Indians today are the colonizers. You see the same kind of thing cropping up. The richer India gets, the richer China gets. You're going to see these narratives crop up. Again, no one wants development. But just to go back to the issue of debt, you know, 76% is owned to these Western financial institutions. But you have to remember that the West makes an enormous amount of money off African debt. And the way that works is you have these things called vulture funds. So what they do is they go into a country, and they're mainly on Wall Street in the city of London. These are hedge funds that go and buy up a country's debt. So say Sudan, for example, owes the West $800 million in debt. A city of London hedge fund will buy up that debt, and then they will sue Sudan so that they are owed everything that Sudan owes goes to them. Do you know what I'm saying? They will buy up Sudan's debt and then sue them because they say, now you owe us the debt and all the interest on top. And there are financial institutions that they'll put more and more on top. And the debt is passed around. Like any financial product, the debt of countries is passed around. It's sold, it's flipped, right? So Sudan is a country I go to frequently. We've released a few albums from there. It's a country I love dearly. I think Khartoum is one of the greatest cities in the world. You know, the Sudanese... The entirety of Sudan's debt sits on one desk at one office in the city of London. There are no banks in China. I mean, there are no city of Londons or Wall Streets in China that are holding that kind of debt of a country. Almost the entirety of Sudan's debt sits with one banking office in the city of London. And before their revolution in 2019, the city of London said, Sudan cannot pay off this debt. We're going to hire someone to restructure it. And this was a story in the Financial Times. The Financial Times is one Western paper I really like because they cater to investors. And investors don't have time for all that human rights, democracy crap. They just want to know, just what's happening on the ground level. So you learn a lot reading the business press in the Financial Times of what's actually happening. Before Sudan's revolution in 2019, which was set off by soaring food and bread prices, the city of London said, Sudan is not even paying off its interest. We have to restructure the debt. The restructuring of debt basically means we have to fleece the economy for all it's got so that we can recoup. So what do? They forced the removal of subsidies on food and fuel. So the price of bread shot up. The price of fuel shot up. Next thing you know, Omar Bashir is out of power. People are in the streets. You have a Sudanese revolution. These countries, their entire destiny is controlled by suited hedge fund Western bankers sitting in the city of London and sitting in New York. The other thing you should know is when you talk about the extraction of wealth from Africa, where are the offshore tax havens where you can do this? Are they in Shanghai? No. Are they in Beijing? No. Are they in New Delhi? No. They are in Paris and Zurich and these Caribbean islands that are former British colonies. The biggest tax haven in the world is Delaware State in the United States. There are no tax havens in China. You cannot plunder a country and dump your money into ICBC in China. But you can, and then go dump it in Zurich. You can, and then go dump it in Guernsey Island or Jersey Island or one of these rando European tax havens. And that is where a great deal of Africa's wealth goes. There was a story of the Swiss Glencore, right? The Swiss commodities firm, which actually owned at one point, I think 98% of Chad's oil. There was a story of them purchasing copper from Zambia, and they didn't pay a single dollar on it. They literally got it for free. It was a whole scheme that they did where they just got millions and millions worth of copper, and they didn't pay a single dime for it. And every time they do make any money, they stash it offshore. So, I have to recall the figures correctly, but something like, 140 billion goes as foreign direct investment to Africa, right, from the West. Something like 40 billion goes as foreign direct investment from the West. Mm-hmm. But 140 billion or more is extracted from the continent via offshore tax regimes, via dodgy invoicing, via all of these things that happen. I mean, if you're a Canadian mining company operating in the east of Congo, and now Congo's clamping down more and more on this, who is overseeing your business? You have your own private security militia. You've probably put in a lackey in power in government who doesn't care what you do, and if he does, he's going to be overthrown. That's another thing. I mean, how many leaders in Africa has China overthrown because they didn't sign a Chinese deal? It's not a single one. There's not a single one. But how many leaders has the West overthrown in Africa because they signed a deal or because the president said, you know what, we're going to have more rights to our resources, or we're going to do deals with other countries. Let me give you an example. The Central African Republic. Okay, so this was in 2013. Central African Republic had a rebel movement that came out of nowhere, overthrew the president, Francois Bozizé. Francois Bozizé was a French-installed leader. Okay, the Central African Republic, for all intents and purposes, is the most French of French colonies. They purely exist to supply the French. The most powerful person in the country is the French ambassador. This is common knowledge. Okay, Francois Bozizé got a little too big for his britches, according to the French, because they put him in power so that he would ensure the constant supply of all of the minerals in the Central African Republic to France. But then he went and signed a mining exploration deal with South African and Chinese firms. Shortly after, a rebel movement emerged. And then the French said, there's upheaval going on in the Central African Republic. We have to send our troops. He sent the troops. The rebels overthrew Francois Bozizé. And what was the first thing the rebels did? The BBC reported this. The first thing the rebels did. Did they condemn the leader? No. The first thing they did was terminate the mining deals with the Chinese and the South Africans. That was the first act of business. Strange. Why would that be your first act of business if you're a revolutionary movement, overthrowing some dictator? Why? Doesn't so.
That's a very common story. Yeah. I mean, that was like behind the coup in 2014 in Ukraine, right? Was that who was not Yatsenyuk? He was the one who was installed, but the previous prime minister, he was expected to sign a EU trade agreement deal because the country was like so in debt, but then Putin stepped in and offered a more attractive offer. And so he signed that instead. And then what do you know? There was an uprising, there were protests, and then he was couped, and a more Western friendly leader was installed, Yatsenyuk. And then what was the first thing that he did after coming into power? He signed the EU deal that the previous prime minister was expected to sign.
I mean, this is the game. This is the game. And, to my knowledge, the Chinese, when they are told no, they walk away. They were told no. And Malaysia terminated something like a $2 billion deal with them. It was ridiculous because they had signed it. And then Mahathir came back into power and said, actually, you know what? I don't like the terms of this deal. Yeah, not every Chinese deal is 2 to 3%, 20, 30-year loans. So, some deals are not great. And guess what? you can renegotiate them. They're open to that. And you can terminate them and say, you know what, thanks, but we don't want this. They did it in Malaysia. In Jamaica, I remember the Chinese were planning on developing the eastern part of Jamaica. I mean, talk about Chinese colonialism narratives in the Caribbean. Those are just out of control. And because the Caribbean's right next to the United States, they are getting bombarded with all of this. But the Jamaicans said no. The Malaysians said no. As far as I know, the governments haven't been overthrown. The Chinese do walk away because they're not trying to get involved in this business. I mean, this is a very uniquely Western thing to do, which is to overthrow entire governments and push countries into complete, dysfunction because you didn't, give them access to your diamond mines or your uranium mines. The other thing I want to touch on, because we're talking about percentages and debt a lot. One thing in the music industry we deal a lot with is royalties. And people always say, hey, what kind of royalties are you giving artists? And I always break down how we structure royalties, not the Western way. We have our own way of structuring things. But one thing I want people to understand when we always talk about resource extraction and resource plundering, we got to look at the terms, right? And the terms for Western deals are just god-awful. The royalties on resources, this is the most important thing for development, particularly in resource-rich countries. You have to sell your resources. You can't just sit on a bunch of uranium and diamonds and say, you're good. You have to sell them, right? Even if you have complete control over them, you have to sell them. Or you have to invite companies in to extract them and sell them. Now, the question is, how much do you get from that? What are your royalties on your resources? You want to talk about music deal royalties? Okay, let's talk about that, but let's talk about the billions and billions when it comes to resource royalties. And the one thing you find is that most of the countries that are mainly dealing with Western companies, and most of the African continent is still dealing with Western mining companies. The most prolific mining companies, the most widespread mining companies in Africa are still Canadian. Remember, 70% of mining operations around the world are headquartered in Canada. That country literally exists just to be a mining, behemoth. The resource royalties are single digits. In Chad, it was 2% on their oil. What the hell are you going to do with 2% on your oil? Even France's, installed dictator, Idriss Déby, said, I can't do anything with 2%. You can't do anything. I mean, he didn't say this, but with 2%, you cannot build hospitals. You can't have a public healthcare system. You can't even have a trash collection service because 2% is nothing. Okay? The South Africans had to fight tooth and nail to pass a law so that they would increase their royalties on their gold sales to Western companies to guess what? 7%. And they had to pass a law, and this was a huge deal. I mean, Western corporations lobbying fought this tooth and nail. No, we cannot give you more than 2 to 3%. They fought to get 7%. Now, imagine you flip that and you get 49% of your resource royalties. So let's start even small, 25%. This can transform a country. This can actually transform a country. And in some cases, in Bolivia, for example, before Evo Morales was overthrown. Now, this I read, but I want anyone listening to go and read and confirm yourselves because I only read this in one place, so I can't corroborate if it's true. The one thing that is true is that the German lithium company that wanted access to Bolivia's lithium was offering a 2% royalty. A 2% royalty. Again, nothing. And Evo Morales, indigenous, strong leader, said, no more of this. You cannot be giving us 2% on our own lithium. And of course, lithium being one of the most coveted minerals in the world right now, right? Mm-hmm. The Chinese offered 51%. And that's why he said yes to the Chinese deal. And he was gone. But I do not know if that 51% number is correct because they wanted to say you keep majority share of your lithium. We take 49, you take 51%. Majority share. Now, the Chinese have been known to do this as a competitive tool, right? So if you have a bunch of propositions on the table, the leader says, well, you're offering me 3%. You're offering me 10%. These guys are offering me 35%. These guys are offering me 51%. Who are you going to go with? Who are you going to go with? And that angers the West because they know their lifestyle depends on the fact that they get 2%, that they give 2%, 3%, and they take home 97%, 95%. Resource royalties are the crux of underdevelopment. in resource-rich countries, and it is the crux of migration as well. Because people leave countries because there are no social safety systems in place. There is no public health care. There is no public education. There isn't a trash collection service. You know, the roads, the sewage systems aren't maintained. This all comes from your public expenditure. And if your public expenditure is dependent on resources, which for some countries it's going to be for the foreseeable future, then it all comes down to what the resources you are selling, what is the royalty you're getting on them. Mm-hmm. And the royalty that Asian countries in particular offer the rest of the world are a lot higher than what the West does. And now it's not only from the goodness of the heart, it's also just to compete, to say, these guys are offering you 2%, we'll give you 30. Come on, we still want to do business.
That actually reminds me of a really good tweet that you had a few weeks ago, that you were talking about how this like liberal slogan of abolishing the border is like a very like idealist one and doesn't really get to the root cause of the problem. And instead of like calling to abolish the border, we should be like pushing our like making sure these countries get a higher percentage of the resources that they're exporting.
I think that argument, and there's a whole book, and I don't want to disrespect the author of the book because she's a very, very bright woman, and I read the book. I forget the name of the book, and I forget the name of the author as well. But it was a book about abolishing. It was a book about it's called Border and Rule. The book was called Border and Rule. Mm-hmm. Fascinating book. A little too drenched in North Atlantic academic lingo, which makes it, I think, very
academic. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I can understand it because I've lived in the United States and I've studied at American schools and all that, but for people in the global South to read a lot of that book, I think would be, you know, a lot of the concepts and the terms. Nevertheless, she made a very profound case about what the border is, philosophically, economically, spiritually, you know, what a border means. And I thought that was fantastic. But she has a consistent argument of saying we should abolish borders. And I just think to myself, well, that's not a very radical idea now, is it? If you abolish borders in a world where of immense inequality, you know, we're talking Miami and Haiti, Spain and Morocco, the immense inequality on very short distances. If you abolish borders, all you're doing is draining these countries of all their talent, mm-hmm. all their people, all their manpower, everything. And you're saying, come to our countries. That is not a solution. That is not a radical solution at all. I mean, that is an absolute disaster waiting to happen. Of course, the border is an absolutely inhumane thing. And I think people who reach the borders, of course, need to be treated much better than they have. That goes without saying. But the crux of migration, because most migration takes place from resource-rich countries. The migration that we talk about, particularly from African countries, you know, the other day I saw that 1,000 mainly African men had showed up in Italy, I believe. Mm-hmm. So now we keep seeing people on boats coming over the Mediterranean. We keep seeing people from Central America coming to the United States. And then if you just open these borders, what incentive is there to develop these countries? What incentive is there to tackle the root cause? And the root cause comes again down to resource royalties. If these countries, there's two things it comes down to. First is resource royalties. If resources can garner 50%, let's just start at there. Say the country's getting half. Okay, you're seeing what these countries look like when they get 2 to 3%. Let them get 50%. They'll have a functioning healthcare system. They'll have a trash collection service. They'll probably have a public housing program. They'll be able to do a whole lot of things that make the idea of leaving a lot less attractive. Okay? You want to develop these countries. You don't want to just open the borders and then empty these countries out, have them have them come in and enter the global north and all of these rich economies, and God knows what kind of right-wing politics that would even develop. But no one should have to leave their country. No one should have to leave their country. So the idea of abolishing a border is, I think, very idealistic, and I think, again, misses the complete root of the issue here. The other issue is, you know, if we're talking about Africa in particular, and we're talking about the Mediterranean migration crisis, you have to understand, no one ever talks to the people. You see all these black faces show up and you just see these images. Do people sit and actually ask them, why are you moving? Who are you? What was your background? What? They don't ask them these questions. Now, if you actually ask them these questions, you would learn a few things. The first thing you would learn is a lot of them are farmers. A lot of them are cotton farmers. And the reason they are is because the EU has the highest subsidies on agriculture as proportion to its budget in the entire world. And it has the highest farming subsidies in the entire world, which makes its farming products the most competitive. The EU flooded the Sahelian countries with its cheap farming products, its cheap cotton, and it destroyed the livelihoods of Sahelian farmers. And both Burkina Faso and Mali in 2001, way back, this was under it was 2001 and, the world was in a mess, so no one really paid attention to it. It's still in the New York Times. You can go read it. It's called Your Agricultural Subsidies Are Strangling Us. That was their op-ed in 2001. They said, if you do not lift your agricultural subsidies, our region, the Mali, Burkina Faso, the Sahel region, which is where all of this trafficking takes place and where a lot of the migrants come from, will be devastated. And sure enough, 10 years later, you have a Mediterranean migration crisis. Now, you might wonder, well, why don't the Africans put their own subsidies? Because the World Trade Organization, the way it's set up, prevents them from doing so. So you have all of these things. And again, we should point out, because we are talking about the Chinese involvement in Africa here, the Chinese subsidies are not destroying African agriculture. Okay? The Chinese farming, what they're doing is not destroying African agriculture. Okay, now the Chinese do have a lot of cheap products that they are able to push into Africa that, of course, can outcompete, and that does happen. Let's not get it twisted. When it comes to textiles, it comes to things like furniture, even some agricultural products as well. The Chinese are very good at producing it on a mass scale. Okay, but they are not determining the destiny of African countries' policy. This is a complete stripping of their sovereignty, right? I mean, you cannot put subsidies to compete with European subsidies because you're a member of the WTO. And guess what? We write the rules for the WTO as Europe and America. And we say that you cannot put any agricultural subsidies. You cannot have more than 2 to 3% on your resources. Now, these are when you get past all the grand talk of neocolonization and liberation and all this stuff and decolonization, we have to boil it down to numbers. We have to boil it down to really just simple mathematics, simple percentages. And when you boil it down to these kind of terms, I think you really get a picture of why the world, much of the global south, the developing world, struggles as it does. There's so many times you see a news article from the West saying, China agrees to deal with this country, or France agrees to deal with this country. And I read it and I say, where are the terms of the deal? Why, as a journalist, do your damn job and find out what is the term? How long is this agreement? What are the royalties? What are in what instances can this deal be terminated? Working in the music business, I deal with contracts every single day. And so I always wonder when I read about Chinese deals, French deals, the first thing I do is I go and try to find out more about the deals. In Kenya, there's a politician that's saying, if you elect me, I will publish all of the Chinese deals that have been done with the government. Mm-hmm. And I think, is that a threat? Go ahead, do it. Please do it. Let the whole world read. But if you're going to do that, publish the deals you've done with your Western counterparts as well. And then we can put them side by side and say, who's got the better deal? And you know what? I don't think China has anything to hide. I think the West does. And, people will probably not get down and deep and dirty with the contracts. I will. I'll look through it and let people know, hey, this deal is better, this deal is not better. And listen, African countries are reading these deals. Again, what do people not understand here? You have highly educated people in many African governments. Yes, I understand that some African governments do have a lot of just, useless people in charge, and most people in those countries will tell you that as well. But, they're not fools. They're not fools. And it's not like every African leader or politician in Africa is a kleptocrat, just wants to plunder their country. My friend, who works in the government in Nigeria, now the Nigerian government's nothing to write home about, but I know for a fact, because I've known him since he was 18, I know he has the country's best interest at heart. So, what is to say that African countries cannot negotiate in their best interest? Where does this idea come from? It comes from the idea that they are my brother, but they are my younger brother by several centuries. So how could they possibly negotiate a deal in their best interest? How could these Asians, who were poor as hell a generation ago who we bombed constantly for the last 40 years. The most bombed region in the world, of course, is East Asia. The people should realize that. How are they doing better deals than us? I mean, you have to understand where all this anxiety and anger comes from. And it comes from not a rational place, because the West is not a rational actor anymore. They've lost their damn minds.